Everyone ignored the mob boss, but a waitress translates what he said in Italian, and they discover something terrible. Comment telling me what you thought of this story with a rating from 0 to 10, and let me know what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you like my story, and I want to get to know you better, so subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The March morning arrived in New York City, laden with a heavy dampness that clung to the skin like a second layer of clothing. Isabella Garcia woke before her alarm went off, as she had for the past 3 years, since she started working at the Grand Hotel. The apartment in the Bronx was still sleeping in silence. Her mother Rosa snoring softly in the next room, and her brother Leo tangled up on the living room sofa bed. She got up carefully so as not to wake anyone, her bare feet cold against the cracked linoleum floor that her mother insisted on mopping every day, as if she could wash away the years of wear and poverty with soap and water. The tiny kitchen smelled of last night's reheated coffee. Isabella warmed the bitter drink on the 2-burner stove, one of which had been broken for months, and nibbled on a day-old piece of bread while watching through the barred window as the day began to break over the irregular rooftops of the projects. She could hear the first sounds of the neighborhood waking up. The garbage truck groaning 3 streets down. The lady in the apartment above dragging furniture as she did every morning for reasons no one understood. The neighbor's dog barking at invisible shadows. It was a symphony of survival that she knew as intimately as her own breath. In the tiny bathroom, Isabella looked at her reflection in the fogged-up mirror and saw her grandmother Antonella's brown eyes looking back. The same eyes that would sparkle when she told stories of a Tuscany she would never see again. Her grandmother had passed away 2 years ago, taking with her the last fragments of an Italy that existed only in memories and in the words she had taught her granddaughter with such affection. Isabella combed her long dark hair, tying it back into the tight bun required by the hotel's regulations, and put on the grey uniform that made her invisible to the wealthy guests who walked the golden corridors of the establishment. Before leaving, she paused at the door of the room where her mother slept. Rosa was only 52, but looked 70, her face etched with deep wrinkles carved by relentless work and constant worry. Isabella felt a tightness in her chest, seeing her mother's calloused hands resting on the thin sheet, fingers deformed from so much sewing for factories that paid by the piece and never enough. "I'm going to get something better for us," Isabella whispered to the sleeping woman, a promise she made every morning without knowing how she would keep it. The journey to Park Avenue took 2 hours on crowded buses and suffocating subways, but Isabella used that time to study Italian from used books she bought at second-hand bookstores in the village. That language was her secret refuge, the only space where she could be something more than a chambermaid with no future. As the bus shook on the potholed streets of the outer borough, she mentally repeated the verb conjugations her grandmother had taught her, feeling the words roll off her tongue with a familiarity that transcended logic and touched something deeper in her soul. On the crowded subway, squeezed between sweaty and tired bodies, Isabella would close her eyes and transport herself to the Tuscan hills her grandmother described with such longing. She could almost smell the sun-drenched vineyards, almost see the cypress trees silhouetted against the blue sky, almost taste the homemade bread Antonella used to make on Sunday mornings before illness stole her strength. It was an Italy she would never know, but which lived in her blood like a genetic memory, impossible to erase. At the same moment, Isabella stepped off the subway at the 59th Street station. Matthew Rossi was waking up in his Soho penthouse with the same feeling of suffocation that accompanied him every morning. The panoramic view of New York City that stretched beyond the glass windows no longer brought him any pleasure. His 38 years weighed on his shoulders like decades, each year marked by decisions that benefited the family business but eroded something essential in his humanity. He got out of the king-size bed where he had been sleeping alone for months, ever since he had ended the last superficial relationship with a socialite who saw in him only his last name and his bank account. The apartment was decorated by a famous designer with modern furniture that cost a fortune but held no memories or affection. Matthew crossed the enormous living room to the balcony, where he had his coffee every morning, watching the city wake up without really seeing it. His phone already showed 17 unread messages, most from his father Giovanni, demanding results in the negotiation with the Italian investors arriving today. This meeting was crucial to expanding the family business into Europe, a move Giovanni had been planning for years and for which he had placed the responsibility squarely on Matthew's shoulders. Matthew poured himself an espresso from the Italian machine that had cost $5,000 and looked out at the city he had helped shape through his family's real estate developments. Each skyscraper on the horizon represented the shattered dreams of displaced families, communities broken up to make way for luxury buildings few could afford. He knew this, had always known, but he had learned early on to put numbers above people, profit above conscience. That was how men like his father built empires, by trampling on those born with less luck. Wearing a $10,000 navy blue Armani suit, Matthew drove his Mercedes to the Grand Hotel where the meeting would take place. The chaotic New York traffic no longer bothered him. It was just another element of the landscape he traversed on autopilot while his mind reviewed the numbers and projections he would need to present. The Milanese investors were difficult men, descendants of traditional families who had built fortunes over generations and looked with suspicion upon new money Americans like the Rossis. Matthew knew he would need all his powers of persuasion to convince them that the risk was worth it. When he arrived at the Grand Hotel, the luxury of the place enveloped him with the familiarity of someone who has frequented such spaces since childhood. The lobby was all marble and gold, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling and uniformed employees moving with the discretion of those taught to be invisible. Matthew greeted the manager, who knew him well, and headed to the reserved meeting room on the top floor, from which one could see the entire expanse of Park Avenue. The investors arrived promptly at 9 o'clock. 3 middle-aged men, dressed with the quiet elegance characteristic of the old Italian aristocracy. The leader of the group was Antonio Ferretti, a 60-year-old man with grey hair slicked back and piercing blue eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything he saw. Beside him was Marco Benedetti, younger but equally intimidating, with an air of someone who had grown up in Renaissance palaces and considered new money slightly vulgar. The third man, Lorenzo Conti, seemed the most approachable, but Matthew knew he was the one who really made the financial decisions, a numbers genius disguised under a veneer of kindness. The meeting started well. Matthew presented the figures in impeccable English and showed the growth projections that had been carefully prepared by his team. But when it came to discussing the more subtle aspects of the deal, the cultural and legal nuances that made all the difference, the Italians switched to their native dialect. It was an old tactic, to test the other party by forcing them out of the comfort zone of corporate English. Matthew replied in Italian, the language his nonna had taught him in childhood and which he had maintained over the years out of pure sentimentality. The problem arose when he realized that his fluency, though good, was not sufficient for the technical complexities that needed to be discussed. The Italians used regional expressions from Lombardy that he didn't fully understand, and with each misunderstanding he saw the suspicion grow in their eyes. Antonio Ferretti began to exchange significant glances with Marco Benedetti, the kind of silent communication that businessmen develop to assess whether an opportunity is worthwhile. Matthew felt panic rising in his throat, Years of preparation and millions of dollars at stake slipping through his fingers because of a language barrier he hadn't foreseen. He called for a 15-minute break, left the room with trembling hands, and leaned against the corridor wall, trying to control his breathing. He could feel cold sweat trickling down his back under the expensive suit, his heart pounding erratically as all his father's expectations crumbled in his mind. It was at that moment that he heard a soft female voice speaking perfect Italian. He turned and saw a chambermaid pushing a cleaning cart, talking on her cell phone in a fluent Italian that sounded as natural as if she had been born in Florence. She hadn't noticed him, engrossed in her conversation as she organized her cleaning supplies. Matthew stood frozen, watching this woman who shouldn't be there, whose grey uniform and humble posture contrasted sharply with the elegant language that flowed from her lips. Isabella was talking to a friend who worked at another hotel, venting about a particularly difficult guest. The words flowed naturally, laden with idiomatic expressions and cultural references that demonstrated not just knowledge of the language, but a complete immersion in Italian culture. It was the Italian of her grandmother Antonella, the one from whom she grew up hearing stories and proverbs, from whom she learned not just grammar, but the soul of a language. Isabella hung up the phone and finally realized she was being watched. Her eyes met Matthew's, and something electric passed between them, an inexplicable connection that transcended the obvious barriers of class and context. She immediately lowered her gaze, as she had been taught to do in the presence of important guests, and muttered an apology, starting to move away. But Matthew took a step forward, blocking her path without touching her, and asked in Italian if she really spoke the language. His voice was deep and charged with an intensity that sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. She confirmed that she did, still avoiding looking directly at the man whose presence dominated the entire corridor. Then Matthew did something completely out of character, something that surprised even himself. He asked for help. He quickly explained the situation, the crucial meeting, the difficult investors, and offered her an absurd amount of money to spend the next 2 hours translating the nuances he couldn't grasp. Isabella should have refused. She knew she was breaking every hotel rule by getting involved with a guest. But something in the vulnerability of this powerful man stopped her from saying no. Besides, the chance to use her real Italian to feel useful through the one thing she loved to do was too tempting to ignore. She agreed, and in the minutes that followed, she underwent a transformation that would change her life forever. Seated discreetly in a corner of the meeting room, Isabella became the bridge between two worlds. Her fluency was not just technical, but cultural. She understood the idiomatic expressions, the historical references, and the emotional subtleties that made all the difference in communication. When Antonio Ferretti used an expression about vendere fumo, selling smoke, to express his distrust of certain projections, Isabella not only translated it literally, but explained to Matthew in discreet English that the Italian was testing his honesty, expecting a response that demonstrated transparency about the risks involved. The Italian investors, initially surprised by the presence of a chambermaid at the meeting, quickly recognized her genuine talent and began to relax. Marco Benedetti, the most skeptical of the group, even cracked a smile when Isabella used a Tuscan proverb about patience and vineyards to explain Matthew's long-term growth strategy. It was a proverb her grandmother had loved, and in saying it, Isabella felt Antonella alive in her words, guiding her through this impossible situation. Matthew watched, fascinated, as this woman who was supposed to be invisible commanded the room with a quiet authority, translating not just words, but intentions and feelings. There was a sharp intelligence behind those brown eyes that he hadn't initially noticed. A deep understanding of cultural nuances that he could never acquire from formal study alone. She wasn't just fluent in Italian, She thought in Italian. She felt in Italian, and that made all the difference. For 2 hours, Isabella was more than a translator. She anticipated misunderstandings, eased tensions, and found common ground between parties that had seemed irreconcilable. Her passion for the Italian language shone through in every sentence, and the Milanese investors, men accustomed to sizing people up, saw in her an intelligence and sensitivity they rarely encountered even in their own privileged circles. When the meeting ended with handshakes and smiles, everyone knew the deal would be closed, and they also knew it was largely thanks to the mysterious woman in the grey uniform. Lorenzo Conti, the group's financier, even commented to Matthew in Italian that he should hire that woman for his permanent team, that such talents were rare, even in Milan. Matthew just smiled, but something in his chest tightened at the suggestion. An unconscious acknowledgement that this woman was important in a way that transcended business or practical use. Matthew insisted on walking Isabella to the employee locker room, ignoring the curious glances of other hotel staff. In the narrow, dimly lit corridor that contrasted cruelly with the luxury of the lobby, he tried to express his gratitude, but the words felt empty compared to what he was truly feeling. There was something about this woman that completely unsettled him, an authenticity he hadn't encountered in the people of his world for so long he had forgotten it existed. Isabella accepted the money he offered, a sum that represented 3 months of her salary, but she refused any further contact. She said she had to get back to work, that she'd already risked too much by helping him, and that their lives were too parallel to ever cross again. But as she turned to leave, Matthew asked for her name, and she answered almost against her will, as if the word had a life of its own and escaped her lips before she could contain it. "Isabella," she said, and the name sounded like music in her own ears when spoken in that cold corridor. "Isabella Garcia." "Matthew Rossi," he replied, extending his hand formally as if they were at a business dinner and not in a service hallway. When their hands touched, they both felt an electric current shoot up their arms, a physical recognition of something their minds still refused to name. In the weeks that followed, Matthew found himself inventing excuses to return to the Grand Hotel. He scheduled unnecessary meetings, business lunches that could have happened anywhere, just for the chance to see Isabella in the hallways. He watched from a distance as she worked, fascinated by the dignity with which she performed tasks that most people in his class considered demeaning. Every movement of hers was precise and careful, as if she were choreographing a silent dance of survival. Isabella felt the weight of his gaze, even when she couldn't see him directly. Matthew Rossi had become a constant presence in her consciousness, a disturbance in the careful balance she maintained between hope and resignation. She had looked him up on the internet, discovering who his family was and the empire they controlled, and it only confirmed what she already knew. He belonged to a world so distant from hers that any approach would be disastrous for them both. But fate has cruel ways of forcing encounters that reason would avoid. One rainy April afternoon, Isabella was cleaning one of the guest rooms when the door opened and Matthew walked in. He had bribed the manager to find out which room she would be cleaning at that moment, an invasion of privacy that should have frightened her, but only confirmed what they both already knew. This attraction between them was stronger than their individual wills. The room was spacious and luxurious, with a huge bed covered in Egyptian cotton sheets and floor-to-ceiling windows showing the grey city under the rain. Isabella stood paralyzed, her hands still clutching the cleaning cloth, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Matthew closed the door behind him, and they stood staring at each other across the yards of distance that separated their realities. "You shouldn't be here," Isabella said finally, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. The rain beat against the windows like 1,000 impatient fingers, filling the silence between them. "I know," Matthew replied, but he didn't move toward the door. "But I can't stop thinking about you since that day. I can't work. I can't sleep. You've taken over my every thought." Then he began to speak in Italian, the words flowing with a raw emotion he had never allowed himself to show before. He said he couldn't get her out of his head, that her presence had awakened something in him he thought had been dead for years, that for the first time in his life he was feeling something real, beyond ambition and duty. Each word was a confession, a vulnerability that men like him never showed to anyone. Isabella listened with teary eyes, each of his words striking the defenses she had built over years of deprivation and disillusionment. She wanted to believe, desperately wanted to believe, that something genuine could exist between them, despite all the impossibilities. But years of disappointment had taught her that rich people didn't really fall in love with people like her, that the most she could hope for was to be a temporary pastime before he returned to his real world. She replied in Italian as well, their language becoming a secret code that excluded the rest of the world. She said he was crazy to be there, that there was no possible future for something that should never have started, that she was just a chambermaid and he was a prince in a castle she could never reach. But as she spoke, her feet betrayed her, moving toward him, closing the physical distance even as her words tried to increase the emotional one. "You think I care about that?" Matthew asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You think your job or where you come from makes a difference in what I feel?" "It should," Isabella replied, but she was now just an arm's length away from him. "In your world, it always makes a difference. I know how these stories end, Matthew. The prince always goes back to the castle, and the chambermaid is left with a broken heart and a pink slip." When they were just inches apart, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Matthew slowly raised his hand and touched Isabella's face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence she had never experienced. No one had ever touched her as if she were precious, as if she were something to be cherished rather than used. She closed her eyes, feeling tears escape, and then, breaking all the rules that governed their lives, their lips met. The kiss was hesitant at first, two strangers discovering new territory, but it quickly deepened into something urgent and desperate. It was the kiss of people who knew this was forbidden, that every second together was stolen from a universe that would conspire to separate them. Matthew's hands tangled in Isabella's hair, undoing the tight bun and letting the dark strands cascade down her back. She clung to him as if she were drowning and he was the only solid thing in an ocean of uncertainty. The rain intensified outside, turning into a storm. Lightning illuminated the room in intermittent flashes, creating dramatic shadows that danced on the walls. They moved to the bed without breaking their kiss, hands exploring forbidden territories with an urgency that transcended rationality. Clothes were removed with trembling haste, revealing physical vulnerabilities that mirrored the emotional ones they had already exposed. When they finally separated, they were both trembling. Isabella knew she had crossed a line from which she could not return, that this moment of weakness would have consequences she couldn't foresee. Matthew held her face in his hands and swore he would find a way for them to be together, that he wouldn't let circumstances dictate their feelings. But even as he made these promises, they both knew he was lying, not out of ill intent, but because he didn't truly understand the abyss that separated them. In the days that followed, they began a clandestine relationship that violated all social and professional rules. They met in empty hotel rooms during Isabella's breaks, stolen moments where they could be just two people without last names or uniforms. Matthew learned about her life through fragments of stories shared between kisses, found out about the mother who worked as a seamstress until her fingers bled, about the father who had died crushed by a machine that should have been replaced years earlier, about the younger brother who still believed that soccer could be his ticket out of poverty. Isabella, in turn, discovered that beneath the facade of power and control, Matthew was a profoundly lonely man. He told her about the constant pressure from his father Giovanni, a man who had built an empire but lost his humanity in the process. He spoke of the questionable deals that kept him up at night, the ethical compromises he made to keep the company growing, and how he sometimes looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man he had become. With her, in Italian, he could be vulnerable in a way that was never possible in English, his language of business and social masks. But reality has brutal ways of invading even the most carefully constructed refugees. Valentina Santoro, the daughter of Giovanni's partner and Matthew's unofficial fiancée, began to notice his absences and distractions. She didn't truly love Matthew, but the marriage represented the fusion of two empires and the kind of power she had coveted since childhood. Valentina was a beautiful woman, a beauty that came from expensive treatments and personal trainers, but her eyes held a hardness that revealed years of privilege without empathy. Valentina had grown up in a world where people were commodities and relationships were business transactions. Her father, Paolo Santoro, had taught her early on that feelings were weaknesses to be exploited in others, but never cultivated in herself. She saw the marriage to Matthew as the culmination of years of strategic planning, not for love, but for pure ambition. The idea that he might be deviating from the carefully written script of their lives enraged her more than it hurt her. She hired a private investigator, a discreet man accustomed to uncovering the dirty secrets of the New York elite. In 2 weeks, she had photos of Matthew entering and leaving the Grand Hotel with suspicious frequency, and 2 weeks later, she had the full identity of Isabella Garcia. The dossier the investigator prepared was meticulous and cruel, detailing every aspect of Isabella's life of poverty, turning her story of overcoming adversity into a narrative of opportunism and social climbing at the expense of rich men. Valentina orchestrated her revenge with the coldness of someone who learned early on that poor people were disposable. She approached the hotel management with a carefully constructed story about jewelry missing from her room, pointing to Isabella as the only employee who would have had access at the time of the alleged theft. She presented fabricated evidence, bought witnesses, and a performance of indignation so convincing that not even the security cameras showing Isabella hadn't even been on that floor that day were enough to save her. The scene that followed would be etched in Isabella's memory for the rest of her life. Called to the manager's office, she was confronted with accusations she didn't understand, treated like a criminal, while other employees watched with expressions that mixed pity and silent judgment. The police were called, a standard procedure when important guests made complaints, and Isabella was taken to an isolated room where her belongings were searched in front of everyone. The humiliation of having her purse turned inside out, her possessions exposed, her attempts at explanation dismissed as the lies of someone obviously guilty, broke something essential inside her. When they finally released her for lack of concrete evidence, but with her termination for cause finalized, Isabella walked through the hotel lobby like a condemned woman. Every step was an agony under the gazes of guests who saw her as just another dishonest maid who had tried to steal from her employers. The other chambermaids, women she considered friends, averted their eyes as she passed. Only Claudia, a 60-year-old woman who had worked at the hotel for decades, had the courage to touch her arm and whisper, "I know you're innocent, kid." But even that small kindness couldn't alleviate the weight of shame Isabella carried on her shoulders as she walked out of the place that had been her livelihood and was now just the scene of her ruin. Matthew arrived at the hotel 20 minutes later, summoned by an urgent message from Valentina that said only, "We need to talk now." He entered the lobby, and saw the manager still organizing papers at the reception, saw the tension in the employees' shoulders, and a terrible premonition washed over him. When he asked what had happened and heard Isabella's name associated with theft and dismissal, something inside him combusted. For the first time in his life, Matthew Rossi completely lost control in public. He yelled at the manager demanding explanations, threatened to sue the hotel for defamation, and used all his influence and money as weapons to reverse a decision that was already sealed. But it was no use. The narrative had been set, and no amount of power could erase the stain on Isabella's reputation. He raced to her apartment in the Bronx, driving his Mercedes through the streets of a neighborhood he had never seen before, realizing for the first time the real New York that existed beyond his bubble of privilege. The shock of entering the Bronx was brutal for Matthew. The narrow, potholed streets, the tenements stacked on top of each other, the smell of sewage mixed with frying food, the deafening sound of music coming from all directions. It was a world he intellectually knew existed but had never truly confronted. Barefoot children played in alleys where trash piled up. Men drank beer on street corners while looking at his imported car with a mixture of envy and hostility. When he knocked on the door of the small apartment and saw Isabella's face swollen from crying, when he saw her mother standing in the living room with a fiercely protective expression, when he saw her younger brother looking at him with a mix of curiosity and hostility, Matthew finally understood the true scale of the abyss that separated them. He didn't belong in that world any more than Isabella would ever belong in his, and his presence there only made everything more difficult. Isabella asked him to leave, said he had done more than enough, that her life was ruined, not because of him, but because she had been foolish enough to believe she could have something beyond what her birth had destined for her. Rosa, Isabella's mother, looked at Matthew with a wisdom born from decades of disappointment and said only, "Go away and leave my daughter in peace. You people from uptown only bring misfortune to those of us down here." Leo, the 17-year-old brother, stepped forward with clenched fists, protecting his sister even without fully understanding what had happened. "You heard my mother," he said in a voice trying to sound deeper than it was. "Get out of here before I make you." Matthew left that apartment feeling more powerless than he had ever felt. All his power, all his money, all his family name were useless when what he needed was to protect the only person who truly mattered. He returned to his penthouse and, for the first time, questioned everything he had built, realizing he had erected an empire of sand that crumbled the moment he truly needed it. Isabella spent the following weeks in a daze of depression and despair, with no professional references, marked by the accusation of theft that circulated among hotel employee groups in New York. She couldn't find another job. The money Matthew had given her was quickly running out with family expenses, and the prospect of going back to cleaning houses or working as a sales clerk in retail stores seemed to be her only possible future. It was through a friend who worked at an employment agency that an unexpected opportunity arose. A Brazilian family established in London was looking for a housekeeper who spoke Portuguese and English, preferably with knowledge of Italian, since the patriarch of the family did business with Italian companies. The salary was 3 times what Isabella had earned at the hotel, included accommodation and airfare, and represented a chance to start over far from New York and all the memories that haunted her. The decision to accept was simultaneously the easiest and the most difficult of her life. Easy because she saw no real alternative, because staying meant sinking deeper into poverty and resentment. Difficult because it meant leaving her mother and brother, leaving the United States, which was all she knew, and especially because she knew that by crossing the Atlantic, she would be definitively severing any possibility with Matthew. Rosa tried to be strong when Isabella told her about the opportunity, but her hands trembled as she prepared coffee in the tiny kitchen. "You have to go, honey," she said with a choked voice. "There's no future for you here after what they did." but it's going to hurt so much to see you go." The night before her departure, Isabella sent a message to Matthew asking to see him one last time. They met at a cheap hotel in Queens, a place where no one would know or recognize them. The room was small and impersonal, with thin walls that let in the sounds of the neighbors. But there they could just be two people saying goodbye to something they never really had a chance to be. They made love with a desperate intensity, each touch laden with the awareness that it would be the last time. Matthew memorized every inch of Isabella's body, the way she arched under his hands, the sound she made when pleasure consumed her, the way her fingers tangled in his hair, as if she wanted to merge with him completely. Isabella gave herself without reservation, allowing herself for the first and last time to be completely vulnerable with another human being. Afterward, lying in the dark with their bodies still intertwined, they talked in Italian about all the futures they would not have together. Matthew swore he would find a way to be with her, that he would drop everything if necessary, that no distance or circumstance could change what he felt. "You say that now," Isabella whispered, tracing invisible lines on his chest with her fingers. "But when I'm far away, when you go back to your world of meetings and expensive dinners, you'll realize this was just a fantasy, a temporary escape from your real life." "You are my real life," Matthew insisted, turning to face her in the gloom. "Everything else is theater, masks, empty obligations. With you, I am who I really am." Isabella listened to his promises, knowing they were honest but impossible, because she knew his world better than he knew hers. She knew that men like him didn't abandon empires for love, no matter how much they believed it in the heat of the moment. When dawn broke, they dressed in silence. There was no farewell kiss, because they both knew that a kiss would make the separation impossible. Isabella just held Matthew's face between her hands for a long moment, memorizing every detail, and then walked out of the room without looking back. He stayed there for hours after she left, sitting on the unmade bed, feeling something inside him slowly die. The flight to London left the next morning. Isabella sat by the plane window, watching New York disappear below the clouds, feeling like she was leaving behind not just a city but an entire life. Her mother and brother had come to the airport, even though she had told them not to, and the memory of Rosa's face trying to be strong as tears streamed down her cheeks accompanied Isabella across the Atlantic. During the 11-hour flight, Isabella couldn't sleep. She watched movies she didn't register, ate food she didn't taste, and thought about Matthew until she felt her chest would explode. She wrote and deleted dozens of messages, words of farewell that never found the right form. In the end, she put her phone away and decided that silence would be her way of protecting what they had, keeping it pure and untouched by the inevitable decay that distance would bring. London greeted her with its usual rainy indifference. The family she would work for lived in Kensington, an elegant neighborhood full of embassies and Victorian mansions. The house was huge and old, full of rooms and corridors that Isabella would have to learn to navigate. Her employers were polite but distant, making it clear from the beginning that they expected efficiency and discretion above all else. Her room was on the top floor, small but comfortable, with a window overlooking a garden where autumn leaves were beginning to fall. In the first few weeks, Isabella threw herself into work as a way to avoid thinking. She cleaned, cooked, organized, and learned her employer's preferences and quirks with the attention of someone who couldn't afford to make a mistake. At night, alone in her room, she allowed herself to cry silently before falling into an exhausted sleep. London was beautiful, but alien, and she felt more alone than she had ever felt in New York, even in the worst moments of poverty. The city was a labyrinth of grey streets and indifferent faces. On her days off, Isabella wandered through free museums and empty parks, always alone in the midst of crowds. The English she spoke with academic fluency proved insufficient for the social nuances she didn't understand. She made friends with other immigrant domestic workers, women from the Philippines, Poland, Brazil, all carrying their own stories of sacrifice and homesickness. Matthew, meanwhile, entered a downward spiral that alarmed even his father. He stopped attending important meetings, neglected businesses that required his attention, and started drinking alone in his apartment while the city pulsed indifferently outside. Giovanni Rossi, realizing that something was fundamentally wrong with his heir, confronted his son, demanding an explanation for his self-destructive behavior. The conversation between father and son was brutal and revealing. For the first time in his life, Matthew told his father that he didn't want the empire Giovanni had built, that he didn't care about the business or the family name, that it was all a gilded cage that destroyed any possibility of real happiness. Giovanni listened in silence, his aged face showing a rare emotion. When Matthew finished, expecting anger or contempt, his father just sighed deeply. "You're like I was before I sold my soul for money," he said in a tired voice Matthew had never heard before. "But unlike me, you still have a choice, still have time not to make the same mistakes." The unexpected permission from his father, or perhaps the disguised condemnation, was what Matthew needed to make the most radical decision of his life. In 1 week, he liquidated his personal assets, resigned from his positions at the company, and bought a one-way ticket to London. He had no plan other than to find Isabella, no idea how he would survive away from the family name that had always protected him. But for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something genuinely right. Finding the address where Isabella worked required hiring an investigator in London, which took 2 precious weeks, during which Matthew settled into a small apartment in Brixton, a neighborhood he would never have considered living in New York, but which in London represented all he could afford, without resorting to family money. He worked as a freelance consultant for companies that needed someone with knowledge of the Brazilian market, discovering that his skills had real value beyond the Rossi name. When he finally showed up at the door of the house in Kensington on a grey November afternoon, Isabella was taking out the trash. She saw him and literally dropped the bag, its contents spilling onto the sidewalk as her face went through a sequence of expressions from shock to disbelief and finally to fury. Her first words were in Italian, full of accumulated anger and pain. "What are you doing here? You had no right to come. Don't you understand? I'm trying to move on." Matthew replied in Italian as well, the words tumbling out in his urgency. He said he had left everything in New York, that he wanted nothing more from that life without her, that he had realized too late what truly mattered. Isabella listened to him with clenched fists, resisting the urge to run into his arms because she had built careful walls around her heart and knew that if she let those walls fall, she wouldn't survive another devastation. She said he was foolish and selfish, that he had appeared in her life turning everything upside down, and was now here expecting her to just take him back as if the months of pain meant nothing. She said he didn't understand what it meant to truly survive, that abandoning an empire was not the same as building a life from scratch when you've never had anything to begin with. And then, to her own horror, she began to cry, all her defenses crumbling before the man she loved and hated in equal measure. Matthew took a step forward but didn't touch her, respecting the space she needed, even when every fiber of his being wanted to embrace her. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, that he had no right to expect anything, but that he needed her to know that every word he had said on that last night in New York was true, that he had spent the last few months discovering that he couldn't breathe properly without her, that all the gold in the world was worthless if she wasn't there to share it. Their conversation was interrupted by Isabella's employer opening the door and asking if everything was all right, her suspicious gaze moving from Isabella to Matthew and back. Isabella quickly wiped her tears and assured her that yes, it was just an acquaintance from the States, nothing important. Matthew took the hint and started to walk away, but not before handing her a piece of paper with his London address and phone number, saying only that he would be there if she wanted to talk, with no pressure or expectations. Isabella put the paper in her uniform pocket with trembling hands and went back inside the house, her heart beating so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. She spent the next few days in a state of constant agitation, the paper burning in her pocket like a promise or a threat, depending on how she chose to see it. She knew that Matthew being in London changed everything and nothing at the same time, because the social abyss between them didn't just disappear because they had changed continents, but the loneliness weighed on her, and the memory of those stolen moments in New York haunted her nights. 2 weeks after his appearance, on a Sunday that was her day off, Isabella took the tube to Brixton. The neighborhood was vibrant and diverse, full of immigrants from all corners of the world struggling to build better lives, and she felt strangely at home there in a way she never had on the elegant streets of Kensington. Matthew's apartment was small and modest, a studio with an integrated kitchenette that was no bigger than his bedroom in the Soho penthouse. When he opened the door and saw her there, the expression of hope that lit up his face almost broke Isabella's resolve to keep her defenses up. He invited her in, and she noticed the apartment was nearly bare, just the essentials, as if he wasn't sure he would stay, or as if he didn't know what kind of life to build without the script he had always followed. They talked for hours, initially tense and careful, but gradually relaxing into each other's familiarity. Matthew told her about the months since she had left, about the decision to leave his family's empire, about the difficulties of rebuilding an identity outside the structures that had always defined him. He spoke of the nights he almost gave up, almost took a flight back to New York, and accepted the life his father had planned. But the image of Isabella always stopped him. Isabella spoke of London, of the loneliness of living in a foreign country, where even her successes felt small because no one knew the distance she had traveled to get there. She told him about the messages she almost sent, but never had the courage to, about the times she had typed his name into Google just to see photos that confirmed he still existed. She spoke of the guilt of being so far from her mother and brother, sending money every month but feeling it would never be enough. As the sun began to set, painting the London sky in shades of orange and purple, they were still sitting on the apartment floor because Matthew only had one chair. There was a different tension between them now, no longer of anger or resentment, but of possibility, of a recognition that maybe, just maybe, the geography of power had shifted enough for them to find common ground. Matthew asked if he could kiss her, and the formality of the question, so different from the urgency that had always defined their encounters in New York, made Isabella laugh through tears she hadn't realized were falling. She nodded, and the kiss was soft and slow, exploratory rather than desperate, as if they were learning each other for the first time without the pressure of stolen time and imminent separation. But when Matthew started to deepen the kiss, Isabella pulled away. She said she couldn't just pick up where they had left off, that it wasn't fair to either of them to pretend the months of separation hadn't changed who they were. That if this, they, was going to happen for real, it needed to be built from scratch, with honesty about their limitations and expectations, not on the fantasy that love conquers all. Matthew agreed, recognizing the wisdom in her words, even as every cell in his body protested the distance between them. He promised he would court her properly, that they would take the time needed to build something real, and that if at the end of that process she decided it wouldn't work, he would respect her decision and disappear from her life forever. The months that followed were simultaneously the most difficult and the most rewarding that either had ever experienced. They met on Sundays, Isabella's only day off, and explored London together like tourists rediscovering. If you liked this video, Please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.